Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. Join us as we delve into the behind-the-scenes world of groundbreaking research and the dynamic healthcare industry, interviewing top paper authors, engaging experts on industry-related topics, and exploring medical subjects that affect our daily lives. And now, your host, Dr. E.F. Rain.
Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, Efrain Riveros, Dr. E.F. Rain. I am an associate professor of anesthesiology at the Medical College of Georgia. This podcast started a few months ago with a goal in mind. I wanted to provide high quality information to every person so that they can incorporate that information into their daily habits in order to get a good state of health. So in that regard, I started reflecting on what has been my medical profession. I started medical school in 1989, and then I started my residency in anesthesiology in 1995. I found out that there are several motivations that have been there from the very beginning of my career. One of them was to gain knowledge and to understand human physiology and everything that has to do with health. But there is another goal that is even more important. That goal is to be able to help people and to contribute to their health. So I really enjoy helping people achieve their best state of health. With modern medicine, that focus has been lost a little bit. So we have been focusing more on pharmacological treatments, and sometimes the quality of life is not the best for our patients. So I decided to embark in a journey trying to understand all the information that is available out there to bring it to the public so that every single person can have access to high quality information. So this is not an easy task. On the contrary, nowadays we have so much information out there. The number of scientific publications is exponentially increasing as we speak. And we see different journals that are being added to the different databases that we have access to. So it's very difficult to find high quality information. So we have a lot of data out there that has to be converted into information, but more importantly, that information has to be translated into knowledge. And once we have that knowledge, we can make decisions based on that knowledge. And I am convinced that the majority of people can use that information to make decisions about their own life and their own health. And my goal is to try to go from data to knowledge in such a way that I can provide that information that lead to actionable insights that can be applied to human life. I think that every person has the power to be in charge of their own health to a certain extent. At some point when disease appears, probably we need to escalate to the specialty realm in which you need the help of a cardiologist, of a gastroenterologist. So I conceive health as a continuum in which you have great responsibility on your own health, but at the same time, we have high quality professionals who can work with you to provide the best assistance possible. Now, as I told you before, I embarked in this journey of trying to understand the medical literature based on my knowledge, the experience that I have had as a clinician and also as a researcher in my field of knowledge, and try to bring this to your fingertips. Now, what I try to do, and this is like a new way to conceive my podcast, is to establish a format that is friendly for everybody. So this format is going to consist of relevant questions that have to do with wellness and health, and trying to answer those questions based on the available literature. In order to do that, I conduct different literature search methods so that I can answer those questions in an evidence-based way. In some occasions, I am inviting the authors of those papers so that we can have a one-to-one discussion and present it to our audience so that everybody can get the most of those interactions. Once I summarize all the findings of the literature and those interviews, I am going to venture to give some recommendations that you can use for your own benefit. And that's the sequence of steps that I'm going to follow in my podcast from now on. So let's start with the first question then. I phrase the question this way: what is the best type of exercise to lose weight? And what can we do in order to maintain that weight loss that we achieved with exercise and probably with diet? So let's start digging deeper and try to find the answer to this question. So first, I'm going to give a little bit of background about what is obesity and what happens when you do exercise. In general terms, I think the term obesity can be understood as an imbalance between energy intake and energy expenditure. If your energy intake is higher than your energy expenditure, genetically, we are predisposed to store that extra energy that we are consuming. The reason being that from the evolution standpoint, we were subjected to several seasons of food scarcity. So our genetic framework is set up in such a way that we privilege the storage of energy in case we encounter that situation of scarcity in the future. So energy storage is like a defense mechanism that we have. Fortunately, at this day and age, we really don't face, at least in the Western world, we don't face food scarcity all the time. So that means that the storage of energy is relatively unnecessary for us. So we need to be concerned uh, trying to maintain the balance between energy intake and expenditure so that we don't need to store energy in a significant way. So there are multiple cycles that happen in terms of energy intake and expenditure. One of them that is probably the most important one is the fed state versus the fasting state. So fasting is a term that is fashionable. People talk about fasting very frequently. It even makes the headlines. But if you think about it, fasting is something that happens every day. So you take breakfast in the morning, then you have lunch in the afternoon, and in between, you have a period of fasting of approximately 6 hours. During the fed state, when you are eating, there are multiple hormonal influences that are activated. The most important one is insulin. So you have an increase in the level of insulin that is triggered mostly by the carbohydrates that you are consuming, but also by fat and proteins. And as you progress through the morning, that level of insulin starts decreasing. And at the same time, you start entering a fasting state. And during that fasting state, some counter-regulatory hormones are increasing. One of them is glucagon, another one is cortisol. So during that period of time, you have like a balance between a decaying level of insulin and an increasing level of glucagon. And that is the healthy way the metabolism works. So it's probably not a good idea to continue eating throughout the morning, for instance, between the breakfast and lunch, because then you don't give time for the fasting period to kick in. And that favors an anabolic state in which fat is accumulated. But beyond that, and let's concentrate on the balance between energy intake and energy expenditure, we see that the balance is maintained by a constant cycle of accumulation of fat and metabolism of fat. So we have lipogenesis and lipolysis with a constant flow of free fatty acids throughout that cycle. Under physiological conditions, if you don't have an excess intake of energy, the two processes are balancing each other, and you don't have accumulation of fat. Now, during exercise, because we know that one way to affect that balance between energy intake and expenditure is to increase the energy expenditure with physical activity. So we are going to, for now, talk about physical activity as a synonym of exercise. So if we think that exercise is a strategy that increases energy expenditure, so let's analyze what happens when you do exercise. Well, the first thing that happens is that when you start doing exercise, you need to rapidly produce energy in the form of ATP. So you need to have a very readily available source of energy at that point. and that rapid store of energy is phosphocreatine. So phosphocreatine is able to donate a phosphate to the ADP to produce ATP rapidly without even going to the mitochondria or anything. So that happens during the first few seconds to 1 minute of exercise. In the meantime, there must be another source ready to supply energy if you continue doing exercise. That second source is glucose itself that can undergo anaerobic metabolism or anaerobic glycolysis. It's called anaerobic because it doesn't use oxygen. So that glucose is converted into pyruvate, pyruvate and then lactate. And in the process, you can produce 2 molecules of ATP. And that ATP is going to sustain the exercise up to that point. But if you continue doing exercise, you need to have a more sustainable source of ATP. Then you recruit the aerobic metabolism that needs the mitochondria to produce 36 ATPs, which is way more efficient than the 2 ATPs that were produced with the anaerobic metabolism. So in almost every type of exercise, these 3 sources of ATP coexist, and they are recruited sequentially. So it's important to understand that. And depending on the type of exercise, one pathway predominates at certain point and to a certain extent over the other 2 pathways. Now, when we do exercise in the context of obesity, I mentioned that the energy expenditure is seriously affected. But before we continue digging deeper into energy expenditure, I want to explain a little bit about the different types of exercise and how can we understand them. So broadly speaking, you can classify exercise into endurance exercise and resistance exercise. The endurance exercise is associated with an increase in the metabolic rate of oxygen and oxygen consumption, and it can be performed in several ways. You can do it at the maximum possible oxygen consumption, which is called maximal and supramaximal aerobic exercise. That can be measured in terms of maximal heart rate. Or you can do it at a moderate pace. Depending on the intensity and duration of the exercise, you can subclassify that endurance exercise into medium intensity continuous training that is usually performed maintaining around 65% of your maximal heart rate. Or you can have high intensity interval training that is performed at around 90% of your maximum oxygen consumption or also maximal heart rate. You can also have sprint training that goes even beyond 100% of your maximal oxygen consumption and heart rate. Those are different ways of performing endurance exercise. It's important to understand that if you compare medium intensity training with high intensity training, high intensity allows you to perform that exercise in a shorter period of time, so it can be considered more efficient because you burn more calories in less time. The medium intensity continuous training requires more time. Say that the amount of calories that you are able to burn when you go jogging, for instance, that is the typical example of medium intensity continuous training. Say that you burn 500 calories. Well, you can burn the same amount in a shorter period of time if you use high intensity interval training. Resistance training, on the other hand, is a different type of exercise in which you subject the muscles to weight, either added weight or your own weight. And this type of exercise is associated with the increase in muscle strength, also muscle mass, and as I will mention later, is associated with an increased basal metabolic rate. So the combination of endurance exercise and resistance training is called concurrent exercise. Gets the benefit of both strategies combined. So the question that we have is which one is better for obesity, right? So before we go into the answer, I want to talk about energy expenditure in more detail. So we see that the energy expenditure can be divided into two parts, like basal metabolic rate and activity-related expenditure. So the basal metabolic rate is the majority of the energy consumption that we have is relatively constant between people. It can vary between 100 and 150 calories if you compare two persons. And this one has to do with the different metabolic processes that happen in the body at the cellular level. You need to maintain the metabolic pumps working properly, for instance. So this metabolic rate is kind of unconscious. It's happening regardless of the physical effort. Now, the activity-related expenditure, on the other hand, you can divide into two parts, the one directly caused by exercise and the one that is related to activity but not to exercise. This second part is called NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So to give you an example, when you are doing your daily activities, like you need to walk up the stairs, for instance, this is not really intended exercise, but it's still physical activity. So this falls under the category of NEAT. NEAT is super important because, as I will explain in a few minutes, NEAT is probably the most important factor able to maintain the metabolic rate, if you will, and is going to be the one hindering the weight regain after you lose weight, either with diet or exercise. How can we understand this better? So when you combine resistance training with aerobic training, several things happen at the same time. So let's start talking about resistance training. When you do resistance training, you increase muscle mass. The mitochondrial activity of your muscles increase, and the need for protein synthesis also increases. So having a combination of those two factors, protein synthesis and mitochondrial function, is going to elevate the basal metabolic rate. On the other hand, if you have a stronger muscle, you improve the economy of any physical activity, like say walking. So when you walk and you have a strong like muscle mass, it's possible that you are able to walk for a longer period of time, for instance. That extra walking, if you will, increases the need. Another example, if there is a box that you need to lift and you are weak, you really haven't been training much, then you may call someone else to lift it for you. But if you have been doing resistance training and your muscle is hypertrophied and strong, then you are going to be able to lift that box yourself. And that is part of your need. And then at that point, your metabolic rate is going to increase. It's not really related directly to the exercise, but indirectly through the increase in need, if that makes sense. Now, if we understand that that is the case, then let's try to answer the question: what exercise is better to lose weight when you are obese in terms of energy and expenditure? So there are a couple of papers that are relevant. One was published in 2020 by an author from South Korea. His last name is Kim. So he compared aerobic training with resistance training in obese male populations. And what they found is interesting because they confirmed that that both of them increased the basal metabolic rate, but the resistance training was better at increasing the muscle strength. And the increasing muscle strength is like an added bonus of doing resistance training. On the other hand, there is another study in 2022 by Dr. Jamka, who did exactly the same thing, but in women. And he found that the effect on muscle strength was not as dramatic as the one found by Dr. Kim in his study. However, the benefits of both strength training and endurance training was very evident. So the result of these types of studies is that both types of exercise are complementary to each other. So they contribute to the increase in basal metabolic rate, increase in overall oxygen consumption, which is healthy from the standpoint of the cardiovascular health. And that increase in oxygen consumption is particularly clear with endurance exercise. Now, the performance of endurance exercise is better if you have good muscle strength. So the recommendation then, based on the evidence, and I discussed this with a couple of authors, Dr. Vassilis Mougios from Greece, and also Dr. Gary Hunter, who is a researcher in exercise. Both of them coincide in the importance of both types of exercise to try to maintain a better balance between energy consumption and energy expenditure. And I will share with you some excerpts of our interviews so that you can understand better what I am saying here. So the recommendation again is for obesity to start with the resistance training so that you start gaining muscle strength. And once you gain that muscle strength, you can start working slowly on the endurance training. One aspect that is important to take into consideration is that if you are morbidly obese, uh, some endurance exercise can be difficult to perform and can put some extra effort or stress better on your joints. So it's important to start with resistance training that can be better tolerated. And then you are not only gaining muscle mass and strength, but you are also improving the stability of your joints. You start losing weight, and in that weight loss, you are gaining also your ability to perform endurance exercise in a better way. So again, to summarize, the recommendation would be start with the supervised resistance training, followed by training with resistance. I'm sorry, with say a treadmill or riding a bike. So start with resistance training and then transition to endurance training. So in the end, you end up doing both of them to try to maximize the effect on the weight loss. But more importantly, you need to accompany this by some degree of caloric restriction so that you accelerate achieving the balance between energy intake and energy expenditure. That's one thing. The other thing is that you need to maintain the goal of doing exercise for a long period of time so that you can enjoy the benefits of this combination of resistance training and endurance training. Keep them both at the same time associated with some form of caloric restriction, and always try to do this with the support of a professional who can guide you in terms of nutrition and also physical exercise. There is another aspect that the evidence has shown, and is that at some point there is some interference between aerobic exercise and resistance training, uh, in a way that the aerobic exercise, which is endurance training, limits a little bit the development of muscle mass. This may be important at the competitive level for people who are like trying to win medals in Olympic Games and things of that sort. But for us, lay persons, is probably not that important. So I still recommend that you combine resistance training initially, followed by endurance training, in both cases directed by a professional. So that is the answer to the question that I had for you today. And I'm going to present the two fragments of the interviews. With Dr. Mougios, we talk about the balance between energy expenditure and energy intake. And with Dr. Hunter, we discuss two important aspects. One of them is need, and the other one is what determines that you regain weight during the process of exercise and calorie restriction. I hope you enjoy the conversation that I had with these two authors, and see you in the next episode. Don't forget to leave me your feedback, and if you want me to discuss specific topics, I will try my best to find the relevant literature and to come up with answers for relevant questions. See you in the next episode.
Okay. One very popular type of exercise is what we call aerobic or endurance exercise. This is characterized by a rather moderate intensity for a long time. For example, if I do jogging, this is moderate intensity exercise. This kind of exercise has the advantage of great energy expenditure because I can spend a considerable amount of energy per minute for many minutes. It is easier for me to jog for, say, half an hour or 1 hour than do sprints. A sprint will have a higher energy expenditure per minute, but we usually cannot run at very high speeds for many minutes. So overall, the scientific community agrees that the most effective way the most effective type of exercise to fight obesity is moderate intensity exercise, because it has a good combination of per minute energy expenditure and duration. So this is the first thing, and of course it is also applicable if we have an obese or overweight person who usually is not very fit. It is easier to ask them to do a walk or a brisk walk or even a light jog than to ask them to do a sprint or to do what we call high intensity interval exercise.
Well, resting energy expenditure or basal energy expenditure, which are very similar but not exactly the same. In the lab, it's very difficult to do a true basal. But anyway, resting energy expenditure accounts for the largest proportion of energy that people expend. For most people, it's 60 to 70% of the energy that they do expend. Activity-related energy expenditure, however, is potentially a much larger one, and it's the most varied. For two individuals the same age and the same body weight, you might expect 100 kilocalories a day, maybe 150 kilocalories a day difference between them. But of course, for activity-related energy expenditure, depending on how active people are, you could have 1,000 kilocalories difference. So the potential for affecting weight maintenance is much greater, I think, with activity-related energy expenditure. In fact, in our work, we've never been able to find that resting energy expenditure really has much of an effect on weight maintenance, where activity-related energy expenditure does. We're not exactly sure why that would be the case. One possibility is that our drive to eat might be more finely attuned to differences in resting energy expenditure than energy expenditure that comes from physical activity. And there's some indirect evidence to indicate that might be the case. But anyway, nevertheless, resting energy expenditure normally does not have a big impact on weight maintenance.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or thoughts about today's topic, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave your comments down below. For more information and references related to today's discussion, you can find them in the video description below. We appreciate your support and look forward to having you back for our next episode.